Hi folks, I'm Spencer, and on today's episode of Cult Mania we're doing another remake comparison video. This time we're looking at the quintessential American horror story, the Texas Chain Saw Massacre from 1974, and its 2003 remake. The original film, as directed by Tobe Hooper, has become ingrained as one of probably the most important American horror films of all time, pretty much being the archetypal slasher film. And while it may not seem it, 2003's remake, directed by Marcus Nispel, is actually quite similar in that it was the first of the big Hollywood mainstream remakes of a bunch of slasher films that we got from pretty much the start of the millennium onwards. For the uninitiated, both films follow a group of friends travelling through a small Texas town. On their way they pick up a hitchhiker, and in doing so draw themselves into a world of cannibalistic terror that will slowly whittle down their numbers. The original film, for my money, has one of the most iconic openings for any horror film ever. You start off with this scrolling text and narration that tells you that this is based on a true story, which it isn't. It's mainly just a sort of riff on Ed Gein. Then you get these sort of flashbulb moments of decomposing bodies with these really sort of horrible, scrapey, drilly noises that are just disgusting. And then, boom, corpse art. Then you get these horrible, solarised red and black credits that it just all sets this sort of oppressive tone before you've even really got that much into the plot. It's just, I couldn't believe how well it worked after all these years, and after how many times I've watched it, and it still just sort of, I don't know, creeped me out a bit. Similarly, the remake begins with narration, actually delivered by John Larroquette, who did the narration in the original. He came back to do it, which I actually think is really cool. But this time, all this narration is accompanied by sort of faked news footage of the real crime scene. Which actually, I think this is probably the best idea that the remake has, because it made me really want to see sort of a mockumentary version of Texas Chainsaw. I think that could be really, really creepy. I mean, in this version of the film, it looks like arse, because they've put it in this really high contrast black and white and thrown every type of film grain you could possibly throw at this over it, and it just looks horrible. But I do think it's like the nugget of a really good idea that the film forgets about until about the last minute of the film, which I feel like they stuck it on the end because they were like, oh, we did that bit at the start, we need to do that again. Then we're into the action of both films. With the 1974 version, the group of friends are travelling to a graveyard to check that their grandparents' bodies haven't been disturbed by the making of the aforementioned corpse art. Here, all of the characters are actually pretty likeable. I mean, as things start to get weirder, it feels like they kind of react in a way that seems vaguely human, which is quite rare for a horror film of this era, and I do think it helps to settle you into the more perhaps realistic tone of the film. Out of the group of five, the two main characters, I would say, are Sally, who's our resourceful final girl, and Franklin, her wheelchair-bound brother. I actually think that Franklin is possibly one of the best horror movie-like victims or protagonists or whatever you want to call them, because he's different enough that you actually remember him, and you remember what his name is, and you remember what he looks like, which is more than could be said for a lot of people in these sorts of films. And I don't know, I like that he's a bit weird and a bit of a knob, but not to the extent that he's just like only a knob or only weird. Like, he's got a human quality. I feel like Franklin works because everyone knows a Franklin, or is a Franklin if you don't know one. I don't know, it's just, even though he's the unlikable one, you still kind of root for him, or at least I do. I don't know, perhaps I'm weird. Perhaps I am the Franklin and that's why I side with him.
Come on, Franklin, it's gonna be a fun trip.
On the remake side, our group of teenagers are travelling back from Mexico so they can go to a Lynyrd Skynyrd concert. All of the characters are renamed, probably just to make this a bit more difficult. And our final girl here is Erin, played by Jessica Biel. We've got her boyfriend who's really cocky, we've got a stoner guy who's sort of the Franklin stand-in, he's the sort of bit of a knob. And you've got a hunky dude with bleached surfer hair, and you've got a hippie girl. I mean, to be honest, none of them have that much personality, and actually they probably don't have enough personality between them to make one character.
Tell me how much you got. How much?
That much.
That much?
This much.
That much.
I think at least the stonery guy occasionally says things that the audience are thinking. He's the guy who's constantly like, yeah, let's just get out of here, this isn't a good place to be, which at least I admire that. Erin probably would have had a bit more character, as in an initial draft she was supposed to be pregnant, which I think would have at least sort of given you a bit more of a reason to care about her. But I think that plot would have probably got in the way of what they were sort of aiming for with this film. See, the original Texas Chainsaw is quite odd in terms of slasher films because it's not got any sex or nudity in it. I mean, you've got two characters that run off to go and swim and you presume that they're going to have a bonk, but then they never do. And I think this is part of what makes Texas Chainsaw actually quite scary, is that it's about being scary and about being tense, not about being brandy. And whilst the remake actually is sex-free and pretty nudity-free, it is also a Michael Bay produced film, which means that at every opportunity the camera can, it takes its time to have a bit of a leer in at Jessica Biel. I mean, I want to know where she learnt to tie her vest into like a crop top, because no matter what happens in the film, no matter how many times she's thrown to the floor or attacked by someone, it never undoes. It's just like, I don't care that I'm about to be murdered, my midriff must be on show right now. This is also made far more irritating by the fact that the cannibal family's basement is full of water, which I was constantly wondering, why is this place full of water? It's not been raining while we've been here. I'm sure they're not paying a water bill. And then Jessica Biel fell down in the water and her vest got wet, and I went, oh, that's the reason that there is water everywhere. So that we can look at Jessica Biel's wet vest at the most dramatic point of the film. And then from that point on, it's raining or there's some more water on the floor. And it's just so creepy. I mean, you know, really classy work there, guys. I mean, at least the fact that, I mean, it's a Michael Bay film, so I guess we can be thankful that it's not any creepier than that. But I mean, it's just ridiculous. Anyway, rant over. Back to chainsawing people. Now in the UK, a lot of people probably think that Texas Chainsaw made it onto the Video Nasties list, but it actually didn't. The BBFC did try to cut the film, but found that they couldn't. No matter what they did, the film was still as an intense experience, and that's mainly because there is no gore, particularly, in the film. I mean, seriously, like, most of the dismemberment, the chainsawing, is done off screen, or, you know, it's someone lay down with their head over the table while Gunnar Hansen sort of does those movements. You feel like you've seen a lot more than you actually have, and I think that is testament to the fact that the tone of the film and the oppressive nature of it is so overwhelming that you don't notice that you've actually not seen anything. A lot of the film actually has a more gross out feel in its set design. There is a lot of skin and bone furniture, and I have to say, I'm going to dub it the chicken room. If you've seen the film, you know what I'm on about. Is just one of the greatest horror sets in films. I mean, there's just feathers everywhere and bone, and it's just disgusting, and in a way that feels real, because it feels like somewhere you could actually wander into. If you watch like those like hoarder programs, or where they get like intensive cleaners into places, it feels like that. I think so much of this is helped by Daniel Pearl's cinematography. You really get this sort of hot and sweaty feel out of the film. I mean, there's a lot of colour in the screen, but you also get, you know, these hot oranges. You get the sky, especially as the sun sets. It just feels nasty, and I think that is in part because filming the film was incredibly unpleasant, from what everyone has said. I mean, it was that hot that when they were filming it, the animal bones that they'd used for set decoration had started to cook, and they really smelt, and everyone started being sick. That's fun. Now, in my mind's eye, the remake was much gorier than the original, but actually it was nowhere near as gory as I'd remembered it being. Perhaps I'd had the same experience that everyone had with the original, of thinking they'd seen a lot more than they had. But I mean, it is gorier. You do get some like limbs lopped off and some arterial spraying, but I just think, as much as anything, a lot of the gore in the film is tonally confused gore, but I mean, that goes for a lot of the film.
They're all dead.
The film doesn't really know whether it wants to be bleak and oppressive like the original, or whether it wants to be a more popcorn slasher film in the vein of something more like Friday the 13th, or to a slightly lesser extent Halloween. There is a key moment early in the film that sort of exemplifies this. After one of the characters like commits suicide by shooting themselves through the mouth and blowing the back of their head off, the camera decides to show us our protagonist's sort of shocked reaction. Then the camera pulls back, goes through the bloody head wound and out a window, and then pulls out further and further. And I mean, it's a really technically well done shot, but it feels tonally very weird. You have a really sort of shocking and distressing moment of a character killing themselves, but then you have this sort of whoa, look at this gore moment that it just doesn't know what it wants to be. It reminds me of that shot from Cannibal Apocalypse where the camera goes through the stomach wound, but it doesn't seem to fit with horrible bleak suicide. It's just, I don't know, it's really weird. Daniel Pearl actually returned as the director of photography for this film, which, I mean, I presume either he'd forgot everything that he learnt making the original, like 30 years prior, or it's just a case of like instinct overtook in the original, because this film has none of the fabulous style that the original has. The film is so bleak to look at, it's so washed out. I mean, there are so many points where there's so little colour on screen that you might as well be watching the film in black and white, and there is so much of the film that is obscured in some way, either through darkness. I mean, a lot of the gore or like bits of body parts are just shown in the dark, and I mean, I know I only watched this on the sort of crummy DVD, but I can't imagine that putting this as, even in stunning 4K, would rescue the fact that it's too dark. And even then, like some of the action sequences, it has that proper action movie thing that we have nowadays. It's like bloody Jason Bourne, you've just got edits like that. It's just ridiculous to look at. I barely could tell you what Leatherface looks like in this film, because he's just hidden behind shadow or edit all the time. Actually, speaking of Leatherface, the cannibal families feel very different between the two films. I think in the original film, they're as scary because they feel human. They feel tethered to the real world. It's like when the cook captures Sally later in the film. He has to go back and turn off the lights and shut the door and complains about his electricity bill. And it just makes them feel that much scarier because you think that could be my neighbour or someone that I actually know. I mean, this all pales in comparison to my favourite part of the film, and genuinely I think one of the most interesting moments in American horror cinema, which is after the third killing of a teenager, Leatherface has an absolute meltdown. He has like a panic attack. He rushes to the window, looking out of it, opening the curtains, just thinking, where are all these kids coming from? He sits down and just looks like distraught and confused. And I think there's so much humanity in that from a character whose face you never see properly. Who's wearing a dead person's face. And yet you think, there is a person under there. I mean, I'm going to be paraphrasing here, but I know Toby Hooper had said that if you think this is a bad day for the teenagers, this is an even worse day for Leatherface. And I think that scene is so good for just making you feel that. I don't know. You have almost this moment in which the film flicks round to his perspective. Again, perhaps that's an idea someone should have done with a remake, done it from Leatherface's perspective. You don't get any of that in the remake. You barely get to know Leatherface at all. I mean, I don't even think he's probably on screen less in the remake than he is in the original. I probably should have timed that. I mean, there is this attempt to be like, he's put upon, he's been bullied because he's got this skin condition and that's why he wears other people's faces. But again, it's this totally confused thing of, that comes after a shot of him making a new mask, and you see him without the mask on, and he's got no nose. And it's like, I feel sorry for Leatherface because he's really freaking weird. He just has this sort of, I don't know, it's like, look at him, he's gross, and you feel sorry for him because he's gross. And it's like, what?
Oh, my.
The cook in the remake is replaced by a sheriff who is played by Arlie Ermey, probably best known for being the drill sergeant in Full Metal Jacket. And to be honest, he's actually the best thing in this film because he's absolutely loving it. I mean, his character is pretty much just if you turned the drill sergeant from Full Metal Jacket into a sheriff. Because there are plenty of points where he just barks orders at people. But I mean, he has grabbed hold of the scenery, sunk his teeth into it, and he's just chewing it for all it's worth. I mean, again, it doesn't fit in this film, but I kind of... Actually, he kind of feels like he should be in Texas Chain Saw 2, the comedy one. He's kind of more like Dennis Hopper in that film. He's just so sort of cacklingly evil. I don't know, again, I'd rather spend time with him than with anyone else, because at least he's having fun. I wasn't. It ties into an idea that the film has of that the cannibal family are everywhere, that this town is pretty much just them. Which is, again, it's a really solid idea. It's just never really used. Again, it's more infuriating because it's a good idea that he's just wasted. They're not creepy enough. The ones we have are cartoonishly baddie-esque.
He's killing him! Who's killing who?
I think this sort of lack of creepiness comes from a lack of soundtrack in the remake. I mean, the original has a very minimal soundtrack, but a very interesting soundtrack. You get those drill bit noises. That's what I presume they are. I don't really know, but that's what I think they sound. That's what I think they sound like. They're just, noise. You also get these sort of low synth noises, this sort of heavy reverb and delay put on, just like whooshy noises. It just doesn't feel like something you recognise as music, and I think that helps the sort of disconnected feeling of the film. I mean, one of the most impressive little bits of soundtrack in the film is that Leatherface shuts a door and there's just this little whoom. But I don't know, it's at a weird frequency or something, because it just sends a shiver up your spine. Whereas in the remake, I mean, I couldn't remember what the soundtrack sounded like when I finished the film. I didn't even particularly pay much attention to it if there was any in the film, which for some films is great because you don't want the music to intrude and you don't necessarily want to know. It's like, this is a banging tune while you're trying to be scared. So I looked up the soundtrack afterwards. I found it online. I listened to it. I listened to some of it because I couldn't be bothered to listen to it. I can't remember what it sounds like now. I've gone back to my notes. I think there's some like sort of creepy strings in there. I think there is a couple of points where they use some of the sound effects from the original film, but I mean, they feel like, hey, look, remember those moments, rather than actually feeling creepy. Honestly, so much of this review, I've never had to use notes that I've taken in a film so much as I have to write this review. For the remake, at least. I mean, I made notes through the original, but I didn't need to. I remembered that film. There's so much of the remake that I just can't remember, even though it's been 2 days since I watched it. I mean, I remembered it being so much better. I'm sorry to anyone that I told that this film was good. I've never come down this much from liking a film. There are plenty of films that I have thought were a bit pants, and then I've gone back to and watched again and thought, actually that was better. This is one of the few times that I'm like, actually this is worse than I remember it being. I mean, I watched it first. I watched it before I watched the original, so that it would have a fair chance at sticking in my brain, and it just hasn't. I don't know what to say. So I'm going to move on and tell you that the original is still ruddy amazing. It's so good, and it creeped me out more this time than I remember it doing before. I think it is fantastically shot. I think it exists in this, I think, being a bit before the rest of slasher films had taken off, it's just got this weird feeling about it. It doesn't feel conventional. I think it's still quite shocking at times, despite, like I said, that you don't see much. I tell you what, the original is that good that if to watch the original I had to also watch this remake again, I would do it. There would be no hesitation. It would be worth sitting through the 90 minutes or whatever the remake is to watch the original again. There aren't many films that I would do that for, but Texas Chain Saw Massacre is one of them. I don't know. I think we need to let Texas Chainsaw die now. I think we should just remember that the original is great and that the second one is misremembered and is pretty good. And that after that we should perhaps just... I mean, there's talk of doing another one, and I don't know. Anyway, what did you think of either of these films? Do you love the remake? If you do, let me know down in the comments, or if you hate it, or if you love the original. Like and subscribe so that you don't miss any more videos, and I'll see you next time.